Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section of redemption in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I also have a discussion of the film The Nutty Professor to accompany the section. So let's get started. Of redemption. As Zarathustra was going across the great bridge one day, the cripples and beggars surrounded him, and a hunchback spoke to him thus: "Behold, Zarathustra, the people too learn from you, and acquire belief in your teaching. But for the people to believe you completely, one thing is still needed. You must first convince even us cripples. Here now you have a fine selection, and truly an opportunity with more than one forelock. You can cure the blind and make the lame walk, and from him who has too much behind him, you could well take a little away, too. That, I think, would be the right way to make the cripples believe in Zarathustra." But Zarathustra replied thus to him who had spoken: "If one takes the hump away from the humpback, one takes away his spirit. That is what the people teach. And if one gives eyes to the blind man, he sees too many bad things on earth, so he curses him who cured him. But he who makes the lame walk does him the greatest harm, for no sooner can he walk than his vices run away with him. That is what the people teach about cripples. And why should Zarathustra not learn from the people, if the people learn from Zarathustra? But it is the least serious thing to me, since I have been among men, to see that this one lacks an eye, and that one an ear, and the third lacks a leg, and there are others who have lost their tongue, or their nose, or their head. I see and have seen worse things, and many of them so monstrous that I should not wish to speak of all of them. But of some of them I should not wish to be silent, and they are men who lack everything except one thing, of which they have too much. Men who are no more than a great eye, or a great mouth, or a great belly, or something else great. I call such men in verse cripples. And when I emerged from my solitude and crossed over this bridge for the first time, I did not believe my eyes, and looked again, and said at last, 'This is an ear as big as a man.' I looked yet more closely, and in fact under the ear there moved something that was pitifully small and meagre and slender. And in truth the monstrous ear sat upon a little thin stalk. The stalk, however, was a man. By the use of a magnifying glass, one could even discern a little envious face as well, and one could discern too that a turgid little soul was dangling from the stalk. The people told me, however, that the great ear was not merely a man, but a great man, a genius. But I have never believed the people when they talked about great men, and I held to my belief that it was an inverse cripple who had too little of everything and too much of one thing." So kicking off the section 4 of redemption, then, we have Zarathustra surrounded by cripples and people who have disabilities, and from their argument it's quite interesting the relation into Christ here with Zarathustra in the whole relation to please heal us of our disabilities, please cure the blindness that this person has, please cure the inability that I have to walk and so on, and then if you are able to cure us, we're able to believe what you say. Now what's interesting is not at one given point at all has Zarathustra had any relation into having divine powers whatsoever? So if somehow they've managed to hear this, it's become complete hearsay, and somehow the words got around that is kicking around, obviously, Zarathustra, but somehow attached to Zarathustra and being a prophet is, quite interestingly, this whole aspect of divine powers in relation to it, which is a completely unfounded case as well. And then we have Zarathustra's reply back to the hunchback, as he says, that ultimately, if you take away the hump from the humpback, you take away his spirit. And I think it's quite important to say here that Nietzsche isn't arguing against the use of medicine here to say, well, if there was such a thing as a cure for blindness and so forth, it wouldn't be good to help and assist people overcome various degrees of level of blindness and help them walk again and so on. That's not really the main line of argument where it's going. Really, where the whole argument is to say, well, despite whatever physical problems that the person has, it's focused upon the mental health issues and the psychological problems. And so we can get that from the line, for no sooner can the lame man walk than his vices run away with him. And so it's to say, well, if someone who can't walk is an alcoholic, and then suddenly they have an operation and through a great success and so on are able to walk, does that solve their actual problem of alcoholism that's going on and the deeper psychological problems of all that? No. And the same can be said, of course, for the blindness example as well. There is that, does that stop horrific, horrible actions from occurring just because then they can suddenly see? Again, no, because previously they could only hear, if it's in a state of, let's say, complete blindness, the horrible things that's going on. But then once their eyesight's restored, then they can see all the horrible things that's going on. But does that actually stop the horrific events themselves? No. And then we have the discussion develop into the concept of the inverse cripple, with the individual who's rather an unfortunate situation of having a really incredibly large ear. And it's that whole point that's really developed there at the last little line of the first little chunk of the section. I have never believed the people when they talked about great men, and I held to my belief that it was an inverse cripple who had too little of everything and too much of one thing. And so what Nietzsche wants us to focus upon is the way in which people become essentially an organ and don't really become a whole individual, but ultimately become defined solely through one organ. And an easy example of that is, of course, is if someone is an incredible lover of food, then you're going to be very much defined by your mouth. Or let's say someone is a bird watcher and loves looking at birds, then they'll be precisely defined by their eyes. And the person with the big ear in this instance then is defined by listening to all the gossip and lots of different various opinions about things, because then they're defined by their ears. And so for the next little bit, Nietzsche develops this idea of this individual or individuals defined by various different body parts. So continuing on then, when Zarathustra had spoken thus to the hunchback, and to those whose mouthpiece and advocate he was, he turned to his disciples with profound ill humour and said, "Truly, my friends, I walk among men as among the fragments and limbs of men. The terrible thing to my eyes to find men shattered in pieces and scattered as if over a battlefield of slaughter. And when my eye flees from the present to the past, it always discovers the same thing: fragments and limbs and dreadful chances, but no men. The present and the past upon the earth, alas, my friends, that is my most intolerable burden, and I should not know how to live if I were not a seer of that which must come. A seer, a willer, a creator, a future itself, and a bridge to the future. And alas, also like a cripple upon this bridge, Zarathustra is all this. And even you have often asked yourselves, who is Zarathustra to us? What shall we call him? And like me, you answer your own questions with questions. Is he a promiser or a fulfiller, a conqueror or an inheritor, a harvest or a plowshare, a physician or convalescent? Is he a poet or a genuine man, a liberator or a subduer, a good man or an evil man? I walk among men as among fragments of the future, of that future which I scan. And is all my art and aim to compose into one and bring together what is fragment and riddle and dreadful chance? And how could I endure to be a man if man were not also poet and reader of riddles and the redeemer of chance? To redeem the past and to transform every "it was" into "I wanted it thus," that alone do I call redemption. Will! That is what the liberator and bringer of joy is called. Thus I have taught you, my friends. But now learn this as well. The will itself is still a prisoner. Willing liberates. But what is it that fastens in fetters even the liberator? It was. That is what the will's teeth-gnashing and most lonely affliction is called. Powerless against that which has been done, the will is an angry spectator of all things past. The will cannot will backwards, that it cannot break time and time's desire. That is the will's most lonely affliction. Willing liberates. What does willing itself devise to free itself from its affliction and to mock at its dungeon? Alas, every prisoner becomes a fool. The imprisoned will, too, releases itself in a foolish way. It is sullenly wrathful that time does not run back. That which was, that is what the stone which it cannot roll away is called. And so, out of wrath and ill temper, the will rolls stones about and takes revenge upon him who does not, like it, feel wrath and ill temper. Thus the will, the liberator, becomes a malefactor, and upon all that can suffer, it takes revenge for its inability to go backwards. This, yes, this alone is revenge itself, the will's antipathy towards time and time's "it was." Truly a great foolishness dwells in our will, and that this foolishness acquired spirit has become a curse to all humankind. The spirit of revenge, my friends, that up until now has been mankind's chief concern, and where there was suffering, there was always supposed to be punishment. Punishment is what revenge calls itself. It feigns a good conscience for itself with a lie. And because there is always suffering in the willer himself, since he cannot will backwards, therefore willing itself and all life was supposed to be punishment. And then cloud upon cloud rolled over the spirit, until at last madness preached. Everything passes away, therefore everything deserves to pass away. And that law of time, that time must devour her children, is justice itself. Thus madness preached. Things are ordered morally according to justice and punishment. Oh, where is redemption from the stream of things, and from the punishment existence? Thus madness preached. Can there be redemption when there is eternal justice? Alas, the stone it was cannot be rolled away. All punishments too must be eternal. Thus madness preached. No deed can be annihilated. How could a deed be undone through punishment? That existence too must be an eternally recurring deed and guilt. This is what is eternal in the punishment existence. Except the will at last redeem itself and willing become not willing. But you, my brothers, know this fable song of madness. I lead you away from these fable songs when I taught you the will is a creator. And so we have this very fragmented idea of Zarathustra, and ultimately an idea of a fragmented self as well, which is quite a nice way to represent the way in which we ourselves are fragmented over time when we look at ourselves, because we don't have really a consistent idea of who we are as individuals, but rather each individual little part of us in a specific given time period is a different little fragment and piece of who ultimately we are. Because it's of course with hindsight that we always can look back upon ourselves and also then say, with a critical eye upon the previous different things that we thought of, believed, had an opinion about, and what is it ultimately that makes us up now as an individual, rather than as the individual in the past. Was it your will and determination to change and transform as a person? And so we can say, in order for any change to occur, there has to be that act of willing it to change, and therefore having all that drive and determination in order for change to happen, basically. And what prevents all this from occurring is the past, or as Nietzsche keeps on saying in this little bit, the it was. And this is represented as a stone that's sort of immovable and won't budge, basically. There's a little irritant that in order for any change whatsoever to occur, you have to fight against this big stone. And why is it set up such in a hard way for change to occur? Why can't we just push the rock over easily and allow for that? Is because change doesn't occur easily. Because ultimately the past acts as a big massive obstacle we have to overcome for ourselves, and the past us that's going to be there. Why is that the case? Because the past is ultimately having created this ideal blockage within us and our own mind to stop us trying to progress in any given way. And it's all those moments of self-doubt that creep back in and sort of act, as he says, as a moment of continual revenge upon yourself, because the past is set in such a high ideal and high standard that anything new coming towards that is going to be immediately challenged by that standard that was in the past. And so one of the challenges, of course, is what is even the point of something new when we already have this in the past as an ideal and a concept, and it works absolutely fine. Why do we need this new thing? And so the past then acts as a revenge against anything new from emerging, in punishment against anything new. And this is really identifiable in the amount of times that the whole idea of something being eternal, this whole idea of this specific way of doing things and this standard is eternal. And philosophy likes to do that and create models and ethical models and ideas for knowledge and so forth that are meant to be eternal. But for Nietzsche here, he's saying, well, if you set that up, ultimately you're setting up the past as a blockage and standard as well that's going to act as revenge against anything new that's going to emerge in the future. And what is one of the ways that we can start to get around this and start to move that big stone that's preventing change from occurring is that little last sentence there. I led you away from these fable songs when I taught you the will is a creator. So it's that whole aspect about the will itself in allowing the whole liberating creativity to occur and to never accept it as a blockage and to challenge that in the first place is to start to move the boulder that's there. So continuing on then, all it was is a fragment, a riddle, a dreadful chance until the creative will says to it, but I willed it thus. Until the creative will says to it, but I will it thus. Thus shall I will it. But has it ever spoken thus? And when will this take place? Has the will yet been unharnessed from its own folly? Has the will become its own redeemer and bringer of joy? Has it unlearned the spirit of revenge and all teeth gnashing? And who taught it to be reconciled with time and higher things than reconciliation? The will that is the will to power must will something higher than any reconciliation. But how shall that happen? Who has taught it to will backwards too? But at this point of his discourse, Zarathustra suddenly broke off and looked exactly like a man seized by extremest terror. With terrified eyes he gazed upon his disciples. His eyes transpierced their thoughts and their reservations as if with arrows. But after a short time he laughed again and said in a soothed voice, "It is difficult to live among men because keeping silent is so difficult, especially for a babbler." Thus spoke Zarathustra. The hunchback, however, had listened to the conversation and had covered his face the while. But when he heard Zarathustra laugh, he looked up in curiosity and said slowly, "But why does Zarathustra speak to us differently than to his disciples?" Zarathustra answered, "What is surprising in that? One may very well speak in a hunchbacked manner to a hunchback." "Very good," said the hunchback, "and with pupils one may well tell tales out of school. But why does Zarathustra speak to his pupils differently than to himself?" So then we have that fantastic point and question that's just left there. Have we ever had a creativity that itself has been fully liberated and unharnessed, as he says? Because the problem is that Nietzsche's really touched upon the deeper problems of the creative process itself here. That on the one hand, we seek to challenge ideas, concepts, structures, values, whatever it may be. And you come along with this massive creative force, liberating will and so forth, determined to make a difference and a change. But at the same time, there's all that force against you. And to say, well, you then become your worst enemy. And then, not only what you're going to then create is going to be judged and refined down, and suddenly everything that you had as an original idea starts to lose its force, starts to become refined in a given way. And it's sort of that point that Nietzsche is trying to say, is have we had this creative expression ever that's never then been refined down in a way? That we've never had this moment of self-doubt, or that other people have not then refined it down further? Because then we get that fantastic line, "It's only until the creative will says to it, which is the fragment of the past," and all that emphasis upon past opinions and so on, "I willed it thus. Thus shall I will it." And it's that affirmation, of course, of the self, individuality, their own personal creative force in all the midst of all that. I'm the one that willed it thus. I did it. And it's really that importance as well to say, well, it's an affirmation of that person themselves as a writer, as an artist, or whatever the creative process is. It's them that should be affirmed and not whatever given standard it is and so on. And you can apply this also to philosophy and to say, well, you can have the whole idea of philosophy as this pure abstract thing where, let's say, Descartes' idea of the cogito is just this abstract metaphysical concept that's created by Descartes. However, using this argument from the section as well, you can say actually no, Descartes willed the cogito, because you could ultimately say, well, given Descartes' time period that he's in has an immense effect upon exactly the creation of this concept, and therefore it's not just purely a abstract metaphysical thing, but we can pop it down back into a given historical time period and responding to the problems of the emergence of the whole scientific revolution that's going on within the given time period. And so from all that we can say, well, concepts themselves are never just this abstract things, but we can relate them back precisely down to the individuals that create them and the time period in which they're created, in a very positive way, of course. And it's just a little interesting line right at the end. But why does Zarathustra speak to his pupils differently than to himself? And again, he talks to the hunchback in a different way again. And it's that whole emphasis again that's made up from earlier as well, that we have this whole sort of fragmented self in which we play the different roles in our life accordingly, that will talk to our children in one way, talk to our partners and wives and so forth in another way, and depending on the situation we just alter our roles and perform it accordingly, and therefore our verbiage and use of language changes, tones change and so forth in each given circumstance. It's just interesting, just that little brief line there about the way in which we're so fragmented just in our everyday lives, about how we go about the whole performance of it as well. And so a great movie example I thought for this section is the film The Nutty Professor from 1996 starring Eddie Murphy. And here's the very brief summary of the plot from Google. Sherman Klump, an extremely overweight genetics professor, falls in love with a colleague. But when he experiments on himself with a slimming potion, it not only trims him down, but also makes him obnoxious. And it not only makes him obnoxious, but transforms him into another character called Buddy Love. And so it's a great wee comedy movie in which ultimately you have the whole underlying premise of the film about Sherman Klump, who is an extremely obese man who wants to lose weight and wants to enter into a romantic relationship with his colleague called Carla Purdy, played by Jada Pinkett Smith, and through all that wants to have the will and determination to lose the weight. And just so happens that he's been working on this slimming potion formula and testing it on his guinea pigs that he has at his university, and then decides to take the risk of doing it upon himself. And then, of course, then we have Buddy Love as a character emerge. And of course, on the one hand, as well, the whole point is the film is Sherman Klump versus Buddy Love. So really the internal struggle within himself as an individual, wanting to fight against the whole temptation just to take the slimming potion and ultimately just become Buddy Love. And then we have, of course, on the other hand, that Buddy Love ultimately just wants to exist all the time and wants to get rid of Sherman Klump completely. And so you have all that going on in the midst of it all. And at the end, the whole thing is where Sherman wins at the end of the day over his thinner self, Buddy Love. So what's so great about the film, for fitting it into the section as well, is you could really just apply all what Nietzsche's just said about willing and liberating and determination, as well as revenge against yourself, all into the whole weight loss and dieting regime. and to say, well, in order to want to lose weight, you have to have that incredible amount of will and determination and willpower in order to want to lose weight, and therefore learn to be incredibly disciplined and regimed about how you go things and whole dietary change within somebody's life. And of course, within the film, we do get that, where he does try to go around the traditional methods, of course, of exercise and running up and down the university steps and so on. But then on the other hand of it, we also get the whole aspect of ultimately being your own worst enemy, and to say, well, it's your past that's going to take revenge upon yourself, or ultimately the positive change that you want to make within your life is going to be the past that's going to try and stop you. And that's precisely when you can see it in the film again, when he gets upset because Carla Purdy has broke up with him at this point in the film, and therefore he doesn't think he can enter into a relationship with her again, given what happened in the film. And so, given the fact he's upset, he goes back temporarily to his old ways of just binge eating and watching Richard Simmons exercise videos on TV to try and therefore encourage himself. But there's a great irony within the film as well, is that he watches these exercise videos, but just simply in the process of just watching them and not actually doing the physical exercise. So not only has he got to ultimately fight against his past self and his way of doing things, but also what's interesting in the film is that he fights against this whole potential future for himself as this really obnoxious, outlandish butthole, ultimately, of a guy who is a potential future for himself. So it's kind of interesting the way that his present self fights against the past as well as the future in the film. And through all that as well, through overcoming ultimately body love, it's therefore Sherman Klump getting rid of his potential future as this obnoxious guy, and to then mold and shape it through his own willpower and determination for how he wants to then be in the future for himself. So overall, really interesting section through its emphasis upon determination, the whole process of willing and overcoming the past. And then also the hurdles and challenges of the past as well. That it's not just something that's just easy to overcome at the same time. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section of redemption in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/dissecting philosophy. Feel free to also drop me a wee email at my address dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at @IamARubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.